Ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment, we're going to begin the funeral services of Dr. Yigal Greener. When the family enters the chapel, we'll ask everyone to rise and stand in place, then we'll be seated as one community. We welcome those of you who are joining us via live stream as well. For those of you who are here, please take a moment to be sure that your cell phones have been turned off. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we are going to begin the services of Dr. Yigal Greener. Rabbi Yosef Shanowitz from the Central Avenue Synagogue in Highland Park will be officiating. And just as a last and gentle reminder, please be sure your phones are off. For those of you who are joining us via live stream, we welcome you, and to everyone here, the ceremony of Kriya was done just a few moments ago. At this time, we're going to begin the sacred funeral ceremony led by Rabbi Yosef Shanowitz.
I understand we have at least one other rabbi here, Rabbi Summers, who I wish to acknowledge together along with other dignitaries who may be here. We begin with the recital in Hebrew by Psalm 23, followed by the English. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar, binot deshe yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yinaleni. Nafshi yeshovev, yancheni v'maglei tzedek, leman shemo. Gam ki elech begeitz al mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi, shiftecha umishantecha, heima yenachamuni, taroch lefanai shulchan neged tzoreroi, tishanta vashemer roshi kosi revaya, ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yemei chayai, v'shavti beveit Adonai le'orech yamim. In the brochure we received, we have Psalm 23 on the inner flap. Let us kindly recite this together in English. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. My friends, we have gathered here today to pay tribute and respect to a very special individual, Dr. Yigal Greener, who passed on Friday at the age of 85. Dr. Yigal was the beloved husband and best friend of Stella for 56 years. He was the loving father of Gilad and Mitchell Zamost, Anat and Scott Cohen, and Iris Ganor. He was also the proud grandfather of Jack and Joey Zamost, Dylan and Sabrina Dessner, Liron Milstein, Shir Dagan, and Uri Milstein. Dr. Yigal's parents, Yehuda and Manya, immigrated independently, separately from Eastern Europe to Israel during the first half of the 20th century. They met, and that's how Yigal came to be born in Israel. Dr. Yigal had 3 brothers, the late Moshe, the late Rami, the late Amikam. Dr. Yigal is also survived by 2 nieces, relatives, and friends. Dr. Yigal was a pioneer who helped rebuild the state of Israel. He helped with its main waterway. He also served in the Israeli army as a paratrooper. We will hear much more about this from Dr. Yigal's oldest daughter, Gilat, also from Joey, her son, and from his middle daughter, Anat. Please give your attention to the eulogies.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone for attending this service to celebrate the life of my father. To begin with, my father, Dr. Yigal Greener, came to the United States from Israel in the 60s. He was a former bus driver who was intent on achieving the American dream. He spent many years in school, and in 1977, he graduated from NYU with a doctorate degree. A brilliant man with a brilliant mind who 4 years ago was diagnosed with dementia. The irony of the most intelligent man I knew suffering from the most devastating disease seems so unfair. Over the next 4 years, my father slowly began to decompensate. At the same time, my mother's responsibilities increased. After 50 plus years of marriage, my mother became my father's primary caregiver. 3 weeks ago, it became necessary to move my father to a facility. He was given a 6-month to 1-year life expectancy. However, I believe my father could not live without my mother by his side, and he passed less than 3 weeks after he was placed. At this point, I just want to commend my mother, Stella, on the exceptional care she provided my father throughout the years. And I also want to thank Gilad and Mitchell for providing their unwavering support during this difficult time. Thank you for your time today.
Hi, everybody. Also, thank you for joining us all here today. I am speaking, but I am talking on behalf of Jack and I. To start, the both of us want to say how proud and grateful we are to have such selfless, caring, and most of all, loving mother and grandma. They have put absolutely everything, and once again I mean everything, into making sure that my grandpa had a smile on his face and was as comfortable as he could throughout his final years, months, and moments with us. Our mother did not miss a beat in these last few years to make sure my grandparents were never alone during these hard times, making sure our grandpa always had family around him while he endured this debilitating sickness. To point out, knowing it most likely would be his last birthday, our mother went out of her way and hired a violinist to come to our grandpa's favorite restaurant, Pixa, and play a final concert for him, personally, allowing us to watch him tear up and smile, making us feel endless warmth within. Throughout Jack's 27 years and my 24 years, there are countless moments that have molded our relationship and our friendship with our grandpa. With family trips to North Carolina, Florida, and our most memorable to Israel altogether. When my grandparents moved to Chicago, we were blessed with the most important thing in the world, and that was being with more family in the same city. And if you know our family, then you know that food always brings us together. Weeknight dinners and Sunday brunches with our grandma and grandpa and our mom and dad made for a perfect ending to the week, no matter what we may have endured throughout the other 6 days. My mom always put together the most beautiful table. Dad picked up the food, and grandma was in charge of her fruit and perfectly chopped vegetables and her famous tarts for dessert. And lastly, grandpa was always in charge of the cheeses. What Jack and I would do to sit down one more time to see grandpa preparing his famous paper-thin slices of manchego like a surgeon, knowing it would put a smile on our face. As we got older, the manchego became known as only grandpa's cheese, which we promised to pass along to our kids one day. Grandpa, I know that you will always be looking out for Jack and I through the travels of our lives, and we promise to make you proud of us. We love you so much.
My dad. Yigal Greener was the second son of Yehuda and Manya Greener, born in 1937 in Palestine before Israel was even a state. Although my father had 3 brothers, Moshe, Rami, and Amikam, each of his brothers each of his brothers had a tragic end. Moshe died at the age of 2 from a burst appendix. Rami, at 29, was killed driving a school bus filled with 30 children and 9 chaperones on the Lebanese border. And Amikam had a heart attack at the age of 40. My father grew up in Herzliya alongside his best friend Yossi. His father, Yuda, worked for Egged, the first bus company in Israel, which made his family renowned throughout the area. My dad had a simple childhood, but there were a few memories he shared with me. After high school, my father served as a paratrooper for the Israeli army. Soon thereafter, he joined Kibbutz Ha'on in Tiberias, right on the Syrian border. There, he farmed the land and helped create the only water system in Israel at the time. It was in Tiberias that my father met his first wife, Bracha, and had their daughter, Iris. The marriage was short-lived, and my father decided to move to America to pursue his education. His uncle, Iris, sponsored the move. He arrived in New York City and enrolled in an undergraduate program at New York University, while he worked full-time as a bank teller, basically surviving on White Castle sliders. I've always attributed this to his aversion to red meat. During his studies, he was fixed up on a blind date with my mother. He showed up at the door in the most ill-fitting outfit, and he looked like a string bean. Despite this, they quickly realized they were soulmates and were married within 3 months at my mother's cousin Carmela's home in Flushing, Queens. As newlyweds, they lived in the East Village and worked tirelessly to make ends meet while my dad pursued his doctorate in toxicology. They spent their days flying kites in Central Park and attending the classical music concerts that they both loved so much. Soon they moved to Brooklyn and started a family. With no family to help them, they survived with the help of neighbors and a few distant cousins. Eventually, my father was hired as a scientist at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. I still recall the steaming hot day in Central Park when we all went to my father's graduation along with his boss, Dr. Kochan, who was so instrumental in my father's ability to attain this achievement. My father had finally earned his PhD in toxicology, and Yitzhak Perlman performed at the graduation, a highlight for everyone. My early childhood was spent in the Bronx in a large 2-bedroom apartment on Wayne Avenue and Gun Hill Road, right across the street from the hospital where my father worked. My childhood was spent at the Van Cortlandt Park building snowmen and winning trophies and learning to ride a bike without training wheels. My father ran in circles with me on the track until he finally let go as I rode independently. My parents were very strict, and I lived in fear that he would catch me watching extra hours of TV after school. But as strict as he was, I idolized him. He took me to Lincoln Center as his date, and even went to a Yankees game with me. Weekends were spent visiting museums and visiting my mom's best friend Vicky on the Upper West Side. Summers were spent going to Jones Beach and Darlington Lake. We would leave at 6 a.m. to beat the traffic, walking miles long, carrying everything we owned. We went swimming while my parents played matkot, a famous Jewish paddle game. My dad was a stud in his Speedo, barbecuing drumsticks on his hibachi. And just when the beach got lively, we'd be forced to pack up and leave to beat the traffic home. My father's next career move was to Baxter and Skokie, where my parents bought their first home. My parents worked hard to provide us the best life possible. He did all of the grocery shopping on Saturday mornings, helped my mother clean the house, and worked tirelessly on different projects around the home. My favorite was when my father sanded and stained all the cabinets and drawers in our kitchen and tiled the backsplash. My dad stood proudly as my mom and I viewed the newly remodeled kitchen. The final cabinet door was nearly perfect, and if you tilted your head a bit to the left, the tiles were perfect as well. Nothing, though, was as classic as when he painted my blue wood-paneled room yellow, leaving a border of blue along the red carpet line, and when he blacktopped the driveway. You can still witness his fine work right here in Skokie at 9637 North Kildare. Yesterday, while I was in Skokie, my dear friend Bobby and I decided to knock on the door. I had the privilege of meeting Barry and Susan Grossman, the wonderful owners that purchased the house from my parents. They allowed me to tour my home, and we spoke of my father and my family all together. My home stood exactly the way we had left it 35 years ago, almost to the exact date. And yes, I have pictures of it all. We stayed in Skokie for the next 7 years, and my parents created a good life together with friends and coworkers, traveling all over the world on business trips with his infamous coworkers, Nina, Nympha, Gene Woods, and of course, his good friend, Gene Euclid. Life in Chicago ended as my parents once again moved, this time to Albany, New York. It wasn't a pretty life, but my parents made the best of it. I was 17 and had already met Mitchell when my dad took me to Kansas to move me into college. I didn't last long there, as my heart was in Chicago. I dropped out, which I'm sure destroyed my parents' hearts, and ran to Mitchell. You all know that story. I remember my father coming to Chicago, meeting me for breakfast, and telling me he was ready to support me once again. He believed in me, and while I worked 3 jobs, my parents afforded me a college education. My father could not have been prouder of me as I graduated, and 2 months later married Mitchell. My dad walked me down the aisle in the most famous bridal descent down the staircase at the Orrington Hotel. He literally supported me as he nearly carried me down the stairs. I knew I could always count on him to be by my side. After Albany, my parents moved to San Diego. The climate resembled Israel, and he just loved it there. He worked tirelessly in his garden, tending to his bougainvilleas. And during that first year, he became a grandpa. When his first son, grandson Jack, was born. We flew 4.5 hours back and forth, trying not to miss a moment in each other's lives. My parents came to Chicago often, and we tried to have as normal a relationship as possible while being so far from one another. They tried to their best to be great grandparents and in the boys' lives. My dad officially became a White Sox fan and was honored to be invited to the games with Mitchell and the boys. He was often in the stands cheering the kids on as they played baseball growing up. As many of you will remember, he was the guy in the N95 mask in the stands. He suffered so terribly from allergies. Who knew he'd be so ahead of his times? Meanwhile, the boys had to fend off questions from teammates as they all thought my dad was dying of AIDS. The glory days in San Diego ended, and once again they were forced to move, this time to his final position at GlaxoSmithKline in Raleigh, North Carolina. During those years, we were blessed to have my parents witness their first grandson's bar mitzvah, a very special day as I was b'nai mitzvahed with him. I chanted my Torah portion and Haftarah and came off the bima and fell into my father's arms. And all the crap I put them through went out the window that day. And the man I looked up to looked up at me with such pride and admiration. That summer, we all traveled to Israel for 2 weeks, and my father was blessed once again to be, once again to be with his family in his home country, to witness another bar mitzvah in Masada and introduce Mitchell and his grandsons to Iris, his daughter, Liron, Shir, and Uri, his grandchildren, and all of his relatives and friends in Israel. That trip was the gift of a lifetime. My father finally retired in 2009, and Mitchell and I convinced my parents to move back to Chicago. He was getting too old to clean the windows on the ladder of their three-story home, wash his cars by hand in the driveway, mow the lawn, and maintain the garden. They settled in a condo close to us in Lincolnshire and rekindled old friendship and hit the classical music scene running. Those years were filled with dinners, holidays, breakfasts, graduations. They were the best. One day, my mother noticed my father's near-perfect checkbook balance. Things weren't adding up, and my dad admitted to having issues with simple arithmetic. My parents sprung into action. Our worst fear came true. My brilliant father was diagnosed with the worst kind of dementia, Lewy body. Despite this, they continued to travel the world, fill their calendars with classical music concerts, and spend time with us. And of course, working part-time as my famous security guard at my best friend's closet. On March 15th, 2020, COVID arrived. My mother said, quote unquote, "If you don't come every day, I will die." I did. 3 hours a day, every day, massed 6 feet apart in folding chairs in their hallway for 8 weeks, and then we continued meeting in my home. I spent the next few months basically as a cruise director. We saw every exhibit, dined at Lake Colonial, Cortino, Pisca, and our other favorite places. We filled my father's shelves with every book we could get our hands on. My father was a voracious reader, his piercing green eyes devouring books the way other people devour food. I cooked like crazy for them. We danced together, laughed, and watched movies endlessly. I baked his favorite mandel bread with no chocolate chips and couldn't wait to serve him his favorite after-dinner espresso in my home. The best, though, was sitting on my love seat sandwiched in between my parents at the end of the night. I had it all. Eventually, the disease progressed, and my father's mind began to deteriorate. The most horrible part was that he was aware of it. He spoke to me often about it, and I cringed at the thought of him knowing what was happening to him. My mother and I spent endless hours helping him cope as we ourselves were in uncharted waters. My father declined quickly during COVID as we were running out of gas. I moved them again to Tamarisk, and for a few months we seemed to be floating above water. We had the support of the Friends Center across the street and a few hours of help on the weekend as we continued to stimulate my father as best we could. But we were drowning. It was too much for my mother, and she now herself went down and needed to be hospitalized. I spent the next 2 weeks carrying my father one-on-one. We ate together. I bathed him, tucked him in every night, and snuggled with him in the morning. I sang him my favorite Hebrew lullaby, Numi Numi, changing the words to Ha'aba Shali, my father, instead of Yaldati, which means my daughter. That was the biggest gift of my life. The next few months, his decline was evident. My mother could not master the care anymore. Together, my mom and I cared for my father till the last 3 weeks of his life. My mother was a hero, a real-life hero. And throughout his ordeal, he kept his dignity and maintained his immaculate appearance that was so very important to him. My mother cared for him with all of her heart and all of her soul. We were a team, soulmates, as she said. We loved him until his very last breath. I spent every day with my parents until my mother convinced me to take a much-needed vacation for my 30-year wedding anniversary. We all came to see my dad on that Sunday before we left. His eyes lit up when he saw Jack and Joey, his grandsons. Mitchell played classical music, and my dad was surrounded by his family. He said his goodbye. I spent a moment with him alone, and I told him, "Al techake li. Don't wait for me." And if he was in pain, to let go. He did without me by his side, and I will forever regret not being at the side of being at his side and at the side of my mother, my hero. Dad, Abba, Daddy, Daddy-o, I will remember you as the most decent man I ever knew. You were honest, hardworking, gracious, respected by your colleagues, and never asked anyone for anything ever. I hope you are at peace now, and I will forever be your daughter, Habat Shalcha, and speak of you proudly. Close your beautiful eyes, Daddy, and I will look into the world with your same beautiful eyes, your same beautiful green eyes, as will your grandchildren. To all of my people, my beautiful friends, I couldn't have done this without you. You all know who you are. Thank you for being here on this journey with us. You are my family. Jack and Joey, my beautiful boys. I'm so sorry if I took so much time away from you. I was so torn. And to you, Mitchell, he loved you like a son he never had. And thank you for allowing me to care for my father, sometimes at a very great sacrifice to us. Thank you all for being here today to honor this great man, my dad, Dr. Yigal Greener, PhD.
Touching testimony. Testimonies of Kibud Avaim, honoring parents and grandparents. If someone were to ask me from a religious, spiritual standpoint, perspective, I would have to say that Dr. Yigal timed it right, so to say. He passed on Friday, just before the Sabbath, when we began reading the 5th book of Moses, known as the Book of Deuteronomy. The section of Devarim, which we read this past Shabbat, contains very strong references to Israel. For example, in chapter 1, verse 8, Re'ei natati lachem et haaretz, bo'u ureshu et haaretz, asher nishba Hashem lavotechem. See, says Moses to the Jewish people, come and inherit the land which God hath promised to your ancestors. And then in verse 21, we have Al Tira, velo techat, do not fear and do not lose resolve. Didn't Dr. Yigal fulfill these verses? Didn't he help inherit the land, as we just heard so eloquently from Gilat, Anat, and Joey? Further, in that very section of Devarim, chapter 3, verse 18, we read, Chalutzim ta'avru lefnei achechem b'nei Yisrael. Wasn't Dr. Yigal and his family one of the early Chalutzim, pioneers in the rebuilding of Israel? Yesterday, on the Jewish calendar, we observed Tisha B'Av, the 9th day in the Hebrew month of Av, a day commemorating the destruction of Israel of old by the ancient Babylonians and Romans. Didn't Dr. Yigal help rebuild Israel from that destruction? It seems Dr. Yigal timed his passing precisely around Parsha Devarim and Tisha B'Av. I can also attest from an early conversation I had with Dr. Yigal when he moved back to Chicago some time ago. And he expressed how much he adored his wife, children, and family. There's a well-known saying attributed to Paracelsus, a physician, chemist, and philosopher of the 1500s. Quote, all things are poison. The dosage alone makes it non-poisonous. Dr. Yigal seemed to know the right dosage of many things in life. Tehei nishmatot tzurah b'tzor hachayim, may his soul be bound in the bond of eternal life. Began Eden tehei menuchato, may he rest in the Garden of Eden. Alav hashalom, peace be upon him. After Tisha B'Av, in the Jewish calendar, we emerge into a period called Nechama, reading the Haftorah Nachamu Nachamu Ami this coming Shabbat. May Dr. Yigal's wife, his children, his grandchildren, the entire family, all his friends who are here and elsewhere, only know of comfort and consolation. May I ask you to kindly rise for the Keil Maleh. El Maleh Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamtze Menucha Nechona, Al Kanfei Hashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Uthorim, Kizoar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat Yigal ben Yehuda Umanya, שהולך לעולמו. בעבור שאנחנו מתפללים ביד הזכרת נשמתו בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר Amen. Again, at the bottom of the inner flap of the brochure we have, let us all recite Kel Malei Rachamim together. O God, full of compassion, thou who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the sheltering wings of thy presence among the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament unto the soul of Dr. Yigal Greener, who has gone on to eternity. Lord of mercy, bring him under the cover of thy wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Be God's possession, and may his repose be peace. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the interment service will continue at Memorial Park Cemetery located at 9900 Grosse Point Road here in Skokie. For those of you who will be driving in the funeral procession to the cemetery, the procession will be forming in our parking lot. Please obtain an orange safety funeral sticker to place on the right-hand side of your windshield. Have your bright lights and hazard lights on at all times. For additional measures of safety, we'll have a car in the back of the procession to hopefully keep other cars from entering the procession. And also, please use your horn liberally as you're going through the intersections. Please do not text or use your cellular phone while driving in a procession to a cemetery. The family will be returning to the Tamarisk at 1627 Lake Cook Road in Deerfield. They'll be together only today following the interment. Memorial contributions to the Lewy Body Dementia Association would be appreciated. That information is on the service folder, and for those of you who are joining us online, you can look at our website for all the information. Also, please note that there's a QR code on the service folder. If you want to send a message to the family, you can use that as well. At this time, I invite everyone to please rise and stand in place as the pallbearers come forward and as we escort the casket of Dr. Yigal Greener along with his family from the chapel. Then you may return to your cars.